20th day, lower water month, 0 CE. She opened her eyes to a familiar scene, one that she wished would happen less frequently. Upon the empty space beside her rested an unused pillow. Half of her blankets were draped over the unruffled sheets, echoing her yearning for the person that should have been there. Dissatisfaction rose within her as birdsong gaily drifted through her windows. How many days had it been since they last lay together? Or spoke? Or even seen one another? A knock sounded at her door, followed by the sound of its latch being released. "My lady, breakfast will be ready in 30 minutes. Clara pulled her blanket over her head. The sound of the drapes being drawn open rasped against her ears. She could imagine the cold morning scenery beyond, the thick winter mist blanketing the vineyards and orchards of the Katsa Valley, suffusing the air with the scent of dew and moist soil. Something tugged at the end of her blanket. Clara tightened her grip, digging in to defend her bastion of lonely warmth. A moment passed and the looming presence of Tyre receded. "What will you be wearing for the morning's meetings, my lady?" Blay. She already knew what she would pick but resented the fact that it mattered. What to wear, how she would wear it, how she carried herself in it, everything was purposely calculated to maximize the effectiveness of her actions. In her world, it was others who decided what one was worth and whether one was to be treated seriously. Before a single word could be uttered, a mere glance could entrench someone in their assessment. Thus, she had an image to maintain, one that preempted what others might construct on their own. One that dictated what was and how things would be. She was the radiant jewel of the Riverlands, a person of incalculable value beyond her pleasant appearance. A reputation. An expectation. A promise. Clara let out a tired sigh. If only people didn't care for how others looked. She would be able to wear the comfiest clothing at all times and not care a whit about accessorizing. Everything could be done as a fashionless blob on her bed. Something like a slime. A slime sounded good. If she was a slime, Ludmilla would take a detour from whatever she was doing to play with her. "What is it like outside, Tyre?" Clara asked. "Sunny, but fairly cold, my lady," her lady's maid replied. "Enough to mist my breath when I went out into the gardens." Let's go with the new spring silks, but throw on the winter mantle with the white scarf. The platinum iris pin, as well. Nothing else for the head, my lady? No, that should already make for a good balance. On their trip to the Empire, Clara managed to secure several magical conveniences, including a silver clasp enchanted with endure elements. Her thought was that she could do away with cumbersome winter clothing, but things didn't turn out that way in practice. The magic item worked, but the fact that she was the only person using it made her look out of place. Furthermore, people would run up to her, offering their coats and mantles thinking that their precious leech was freezing in the streets. The fact that she was off drew energy away from where she wanted people to focus it, so the initial idea had been a failure. That being said, she was able to achieve a degree of success with some experimentation. As long as observers could rationalize that she was protected from the elements, she could still dress lightly. Being a half-step ahead in seasonal fashion seemed to lend to a forward-facing image that was very well received. Clara was already seen as a harbinger of progress and prosperity by her subjects, so her modified look fit in nicely to maintain that impression. Once her preparations for the morning were complete, Clara stepped out of her solar on the 4th floor of Castle Corlin. In reality, it was the palace on the grounds of the actual Castle Corlin, which was the fortress that encompassed the 1,800-meter-long island south of Corlin Harbour. Everyone started calling the palace Castle Corlin, however, so the name stuck. Did I make it too small? No, this is fine, probably. The fortifications were manned and operated by the Royal Army, which suited her just fine. 50% of the fortress grounds contained storage facilities for House Corlin. 20% was managed woodland and 10% was the killing field that the highway ran through. The remainder was the palace grounds, upon which her new home had been built. Her palace was a rectangular complex that covered roughly 20,000 square meters and was divided into western and eastern halves. The eastern half was the administrative section containing offices and archives. It had been built with the future development of the Sorceress Kingdom in mind, so there was still much in the way of unused space. In the western section, there were 4 basement levels. On the bottom level, experiments on indoor farming using magical means were being conducted. The third and second basements were storage areas, while the first basement was where most of the facilities related to household maintenance were located. Housing for the regular palace staff occupied the main floor. The second floor contained all of the facilities required to host diplomatic functions. Staterooms, which were essentially self-contained manors within the palace where guests were accommodated, comprised the majority of the third floor. Clara's residence, which included the rooms of her personal attendants, made up the entirety of the fourth floor. Finally, there was a private garden on the roof of the fourth floor. Within this garden was a 1,000 square meter structure that served as the physical court of Lady Shaltir Bloodfallen, at least as far as her role as their liege was concerned. While the builders were dwarves, with the majority of the labor provided by undead and golems, the pristine limestone architecture still conveyed the hallmarks of Riverland's culture. The palace was a provincial chateau that projected the relaxing, pastoral atmosphere of fertile valleys filled with prosperous villages amidst orchards and vineyards that stretched as far as the eye could see. For now, the grounds were bare, but they would soon be overflowing with vibrant greenery. Accompanied by two of her maids, Clara made her way down the stairs that flowed into the atrium of the Eastern Palace. There, over a half-dozen figures awaited her. Standing at the leftmost was Dix, the head of the Elder Lich administrators assigned to Corlin County. One Elder Lich was assigned to each of the 14 baronies in her domain, while 3 Elder Liches were assigned to each of the 3 towns along the highway. Dix coordinated them all from its office in the palace, making for a total of 24 Elder Lich administrators working in her fief. Next to Dix stood 3 vampire brides. One was in the dark blue uniform of the Postal Service and another sported the blue-grey uniform of the Harbour Staff. The third was one of the 3 assigned to her by Lady Shaltira's staff from the Ministry of Transportation, still adorned in the default alabaster silks of Lady Shaltira's handmaidens. Beside the vampire brides was the guildmaster of the local merchant guild, and next to him was one of the paladins from the slain theocracy, Giorgio Martelli. He was accompanied by his 2 squires, Rosalina and Xavier. The entire assembly lowered their heads at her approach. "Good morning, Countess Corlin." "Good morning." Clara smiled at their greeting. "Shall we attend to business?" She bid Dix accompany her, then stopped to address Brother Martelli. The man's neatly trimmed golden beard shifted as he set his expression under her gaze. "It was not necessary to come so early, Brother Martelli." "I could not risk being late, my lady." Far from being late, he was roughly 2 hours early. Clara's schedule was not set in stone, but it usually took at least that long to see to her morning tasks. "Ophelia," Clara said, "please attend to Brother Martelli and his squires. See to any needs they might have. Brother Martelli, feel free to use the gardens or one of the empty offices for instruction while you wait. Then we shall take you up on your offer." "Thank you for your consideration, my lady." After watching them walk part way to the entrance, Clara turned to head to her office, ascending the spiral staircase of the Eastern Palace's northwestern tower. Like those on the 3rd floors of the palace upwards, the room stood above the fortress walls and offered an unobstructed view of the landscape in all directions. As she settled behind her desk, a pair of elder liches from the Royal Army flew by, pausing to investigate the activity in the office before resuming their patrol. "Is there anything that requires my immediate attention, Dix?" "Nothing critical has been brought to my attention, Lady Corlin." Clara leaned back in her seat, collecting her hands in her lap. "We should get through things in order, then. What do you have for me first?" "Lady Albedo has received your proposals," the Elder Lich told her. "She has voiced her tentative approval for each one, but official approval will be pending a more thorough analysis." "Good. What else?" Dix reached into its inventory, withdrawing a nondescript brown folder. He placed it on the desk in front of her. "Copies of the customs papers you requested for the party of House Flavella," the Elder Lich said. "Are you certain the security arrangements are sufficient?" "If we arrange for any more security," Clara said, "our guests will be jumping out of the windows. Aside from that, when entertaining dignitaries, supporting elements should be invisible. The only visible elements are purposely selected and positioned to impress the prestige of the host and the nation upon our guests." "In that case, should our preparations not have been more robust?" In addition to the castle guard and the river patrols provided by the Royal Army, 6 shadow demons lurked around the palace grounds. A dozen powerful ninjas from Myjania were operating undercover as palace staff with a pair of Hanzos close at hand under orders from Lord Demiurge. They referred to their duties as Niwarban or something to that effect and were strangely enthusiastic about it. Calling Castle had enough security to level half of the continent, but the Elder Leech's question was to be expected of one of His Majesty's created servitors. When it came to their service to the Sorcerer King, restraint vanished from their vocabulary. Lady Albedo, who trained Dix, should have been aware of diplomatic protocols and the reasoning behind them, but Clara supposed that they wouldn't have been a part of an administrative leech's education. Diplomatic functions are a battlefield of their own, Clara told the Elder Lich. An adept diplomat always prepares the right tools for the right job for every step in their negotiations. The excessive deployment of assets may be interpreted as belligerence, desperation or incompetence on the part of the host. In all cases, it does not help to build respect for His Majesty or the Sorceress Kingdom. With fear comes a form of respect. Clara looked up from her reading, holding the Elder Leech's crimson gaze with her own. Respect out of fear is never genuine, her firm voice carried softly across the office. Reverence out of respect is never false. Do you not wish for the world to genuinely revere His Majesty? Or do you wish for His Majesty to be the target of hatred, malice and scorn? Do His directives for the Sorceress Kingdom not indicate a desire for one over the other? I would wish for all to revere our master, of course. But I do not understand the processes of diplomacy. Nor would the Elder Lich ever, it seemed. A summon was created with strict specifications and could never step past the bounds set by those specifications. The Elder Liches created by His Majesty were intelligent, but their limitations had become clear over the past year. They could not be taught diplomacy any more than they could be taught to cook or smith. What amounted to diplomacy for an Elder Lich was a set of simple demands and threats that one might hear made on a battlefield. The extent of what they could do had been noted by Clara and several others as mundane which amounted to basic functions in Clara's estimation. Their administrative training also observed this limited capacity. Procedures, manuals, almanacs, tables and forms were provided so that the Elder Liches could function in a basic administrative role. Complex management decisions without precedent were simply beyond them. At best, they amounted to random guesses as to what might work. There was a certain threshold in their functionality, and anything above that threshold was impossible. Skills and abilities related to civilian vocations were entirely out of the question. Not that she was unappreciative of the Elder Liches. Their work was invaluable, compiling a nation's worth of data so that those who were capable of making crucial and complex decisions could do so with an unprecedented wealth of information. What it did mean, however, was that the Sorceress Kingdom needed more administrators qualified to fill middle management positions. If they happened to have another large chunk of land dumped on them, Lady Albedo, who was not only the Prime Minister but effectively the sole decision-maker in the executive and judiciary branches of the government, would be buried in work. Knowing her, she would be supremely pleased over the chance to further demonstrate her quality to the Sorcerer King, but understaffed was understaffed. The broad shortage of qualified government functionaries was perhaps the greatest emergency facing the Sorceress Kingdom. For all of its might and wealth, they were a one-year-old country that was formerly a duchy on the edge of re-ties. They lacked the institutions required to produce the officials necessary to run a country, institutions that took decades to raise. For the time being, they were managing under the excellence of Lady Albedo and what remained of the local leadership, but things were clearly lopsided and bound to get worse. For the time being, Clara said, just leave it to us. Diplomacy is one of a civilian noble's strong suits, after all. The Elder Liches will still have an invaluable role as administrative aides to our diplomats, but getting our domestic affairs in order has been the priority thus far. Much like your work with the local administration, your assistance in and observation of diplomatic proceedings will contribute data from which procedures can be derived in the future. Dix was probably looking forward to that. The eagerness of the Elder Liches when it came to observing new things related to their duties was rather cute, if not unsettling for those unaccustomed to their intense scrutiny. An anomaly has been identified for Administrative Division C13, subsection 11. Moving on to more mundane business, Clara's thoughts traveled to the village in question. Was there something wrong with Form S0021? Indeed, Dix nodded. The tabulations have produced values beyond projected parameters for lines D2, D5 and G3. That should be a problem with forms S0009 and S0013, she told the Elder Lich. Dispatch the administrator for District C13 to confirm the values. I suspect we will see the same anomalies across the county, if not the entire duchy. Then this is indicative of a greater problem? It is indicative of progress. The improved processes facilitated by our new equipment, labor utilization and agricultural techniques are rendering last year's materials obsolete. We have a lot of new data to collect. Their exchange was probably the most glaring indication of the Elder Lich's limits. Without data, the materials that they needed to function nominally could not exist. Even with data, they were remarkably inflexible and prone to enforcing what they believed to be unquestionable bureaucratic standards. Having them arbitrarily force procedures and standards onto the citizens in non-standard situations led to all manner of issues, and only those with recognized authority could override them. Lady Albedo foresaw the problem, of course, but what could be done in such a short span of time was limited. The Sorceress Kingdom was undergoing radical change and everything was in a state of flux. For the time being, acceptable margins of error were widened and contingencies were implemented for results that they could do nothing about. All anomalies were reported to their superiors and handed up the bureaucratic ladder until they reached someone capable of analyzing and addressing the problem, usually one of the nobles or guildmasters. We need to hurry with that academy. They needed qualified professionals for many positions. The lowest-ranked administrative functionaries under the old system, village chiefs, needed to become proper magistrates. The nobility needed to all be brought onto the same page and required properly trained support staff. Towns without presiding nobles still needed staff for their town halls. Standards for the militia and judicial agents were called for at all levels as well. A mountain of work lay before them, and they had barely started laying the foundations for institutions crucial to the state. Despite the countless challenges that lay before her, Clara was generally pleased about her work. The faith of the Six called for everyone to do their utmost in their respective vocations, but with her ability, nothing had remotely been a challenge until now. That she could live in a time that allowed her to explore the limits of her capabilities was both uplifting and edifying. Furthermore, she did so in service to her God, who had returned to live amongst them once again. Truly, her life was blessed. After spending an hour going over regular domain business, Dix left the office to update its subordinates on the morning's decisions. In his place came the 3 vampire brides. Unlike her meeting with the Elder Lich, they went to make themselves comfortable around a table where teacups were set out for her guests to use. Clara tended to prefer speaking in more familiar settings, especially when it came to those she regularly dealt with. Lady Sheltier's vampire brides all appeared to be well versed in matters of etiquette, at least according to their customs, and they expressed their appreciation for her hospitality. As representatives of different branches within the Ministry of Transportation, they should have come in separately, but Clara supposed that it didn't matter too much as they were all Lady Sheltier's handmaidens. Furthermore, while there was a sense of rivalry between ministries when it came to their service to the Sorcerer King, conflicts of interest within departments appeared to be non-existent. Clara waited until they filled their cups with the bottles of blood that they had brought with them. A light second breakfast would be served at her next meeting with the head of the Merchant Guild, so she refrained from taking any refreshments. Lady Corlin, the postal official said. A group of our new employees has requested accommodations here. Here? Clara frowned. Castle Corlin, my lady, the vampire bride told her. More precisely, the cliffs on the southern side of this island. The vampire post's new employees were harpies who had come down from the Azalizia Mountains, demi-humans who had talons like birds, the bodies of humanoid women and wings that spanned over 3 meters. They were a carnivorous race, but there was more than enough meat to support them. All they needed was work, which they found as local delivery staff for the vampire post. Clara had offered them a place to nest in one of the residential areas of Corlin Harbor, but perhaps that hadn't been enough. Were there issues with the accommodations that we provided? According to their representative, the vampire bride replied, they were livable. After familiarizing themselves with the area, they found the cliffs to be highly attractive by comparison. They're suitably tall, isolated, warm and shielded from the wind. When it came to understanding and working with different races, Ludmilla and Florine were far ahead of her. Aside from the undead, the Harpies were the first non-humans to take up residence in Corlin County. I see. Well, I don't personally mind, But we will have to check with the Royal Army first. There are security regulations to observe. After that, if they were allowed to nest there, how would tenancy work? She guessed that they would consider the old contract a bargain. At some point, she would have to corner Ludmilla and pick her brain on the topic of other races and how to accommodate them. She probably had an intimidating pile of incomprehensible bylaws and special dispensations that streamlined her territorial operations. Aside from amendments and additions to the Crown laws, Clara said, calling counties regulations are still, by and large, the product of human legislation. Updates to local laws will be required to properly determine how tenancy for each race will work. I will let them know, my lady. Is there anything else? No, my lady, the vampire bride replied. The new employees appear to be generally well received. That was saying a lot for a population that was entirely composed of followers of the Six. Not a year ago they would have probably chased the harpies off with sticks and stones. Clara had an inkling as to what the vampire bride from the harbor had come for, so she skipped to the official from the Ministry of Transportation. We're running low on stone, my lady, the vampire bride said. Our supplies are projected to last 2 more weeks. I was afraid of that, Clara sighed. With development accelerating in Warden's Vale, the once abundant stone from Ludmilla's territory was being reserved for local construction. Ruin's Wake had cleared the glut in supply over the winter, and what was delivered after that came from a contract that Clara felt was fair for the both of them. That being said, there was a new initiative slated to begin over the summer in the frontier territory that would result in a fresh supply, so the shortage would be a temporary one. I suppose House Ardoin's quarries are still delivering on all of their existing contracts, as well. Yes, my lady. The trade agreement between House Corlin and House Saradnik ensures that we get stone in greater quantities than what every other house purchases from House Ardoin, but, at the same time, we have more territory to cover than the rest. Purchasing stone from the Dwarf Kingdom was an option, but the Northern Highway hadn't been completed yet. Between tolls and the costs associated with labor and animals, transporting those goods through the Empire would double their price relative to stone sold in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Stone from the Theocracy was even more expensive as their lands had long been developed, and it was usually the Theocracy that imported stone from the north. Undead logistics made everything else seem exorbitantly expensive by comparison, and opportunity costs weren't high enough that anyone was willing to import. The nobles who held the contracts to House Ardoin's stone didn't dare resell what was delivered to them out of the fear that they would be seen as stalling development for personal gains. As a result, most were simply content to wait for the completion of the highway and the increased flow of cheap materials from the Dwarf Kingdom. Delays will be inevitable, it seems. Do the Katsa Plains not have any stone? There's plenty of rubble, but the ruins are still being studied. The remaining structures are being preserved for other purposes. According to the findings made so far, most of the stone used in construction there was imported from elsewhere. At this rate, we may as well ask the Katsa Institute to summon stone instead of salt. Can they do that, my lady? They cannot. They stared at one another for several moments. Such were the times. Even a statement made in jest could lead to some possibility made possible by the circumstances and capabilities of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. I'll send someone to ask after this, the vampire bride said. That was all I had to bring to your attention, my lady. The vampire bride, working with the Harbor Authority, reported at the last, bringing the news that Clara had been anticipating for the last few days. My lady, the first of the barges has been gated in from the north. Were there any issues with the trials or delivery? Clara asked. A grey folder was produced from the vampire bride's inventory. She placed it on the table between them. These are the results from the sea trials. The barge is being inspected in Dry Dock 1 at the moment, but a cursory inspection has revealed no damage from the transfer. Excellent, Clara smiled. What about the other vessels? They'll arrive as they finish their trials. If all goes well, all 12 will be in their berths here before the end of winter. What about Wagner's end of things? Our associates in, the town report that everything is going according to schedule. The harbor equipment has been delivered over the past week. Everything else will begin to arrive when Lady Garnier and Lady Wagner return to the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Clara nodded, suppressing the excitement welling up within her. Nearly a year of their combined efforts was finally coming together. By summer, their world would be a very different place. Would you like to inspect the new vessel, my lady? The vampire bride asked. I will wait for Wagner, Clara answered. She is certain to get angry at me if I sneak a peek ahead of her. Get everything assembled as it arrives, but do not take them out yet. Yes, my lady. The vampire brides rose and lowered their heads respectfully before filing out of the room. Tyre and the others prepared the table for the next meeting. The head of the Merchant Guild was a man who could almost be described as portly. He wore the trappings of position, which included the ubiquitous brown uniform with the 8-spoked wheel of the guild embroidered in thread of gold on the breast of his coat. He almost looked like a retainer of House Wagner, though Clara supposed it was actually the other way around. Formerly a senior member of the Erantal Merchant Guild, he had come to call in harbor with a handful of staff from the city to assume a position that had likely accelerated the graying of his midnight hair. Between them, her maids set a modest breakfast of toast, sweetened preserves and a strong black tea imported from plantations in the theocracy. They settled down for a bite before getting to the business at hand. I am not opposed to this method, my lady. The man's curls bobbed as he set down his tea, but are you certain you wish to relinquish so much power to the guilds? While I cannot speak for the rest of the House of Lords, Clara replied, House Corlin, House Wagner and House Garnier all agree that it is better for the long term. The markets are best served by quick and efficient transactions, and what we are doing merely formalizes the regulations of the guilds in international trade. I can't imagine that the other houses will be pleased. Clara suppressed her urge to smile at the odd exchange. Generally speaking, merchants did what they could to maximize profits, but the change she was implementing probably felt too good to be true. No one accustomed to the old ways will like this, she replied. But they will be forced to compete regardless. I believe that, more than anyone, the guilds understand the implications of the ongoing developments in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. This is a necessary step to a prosperous future. The old ways that Clara referred to were the conditions imposed on industry and trade by the nobility, who held the legal rights and authority to run their territories as they saw fit as long as they did not run afoul of the crown laws. Presumably, this allowed a local lord the freedom to regulate and make fine adjustments to their territorial economy, ensuring that their lands as a whole could smoothly function to support its people. In practice, however, whether this happened or not was at the whim of the seated administrator. In most cases, ways that were seen as normal, traditional and moral were opaque, uncompetitive and stifled innovation. Administrators could be incentivized to maintain inefficient market practices and prop up various industries and interests with unfair and arbitrary measures. In the worst cases, issues became systematic and progressively worse. Industries could be forced to sell their goods at favorable prices to companies owned by local authorities or lose their license to operate entirely. Exemptions were purchased through bribery and other private arrangements. Racketeering became rampant and tenant agreements effectively became contracts of serfdom and slavery. Were the problem limited to the nobility, it could be easily addressed. Unfortunately, it was behavior that could be found at any level of administration and business. One's actions could even be affected by external elements, such as powerful political interests, merchant and industrial cartels, and criminal syndicates. If she were to parrot Leanne's cynical views on the matter, people did what they thought they could get away with to get what they wanted. The degree to which proper, righteous behavior regulated the people was not uniform. Thus, enforceable rules and regulations needed to be enacted by those in authority. At the same time, however, they could not be harmful to the territory. In the Sorcerer's Kingdom, the usual barriers to change did not exist. A remarkable degree of transparency was made possible by the tireless efforts of the elder liches. Powerful individuals could not simply walk in and erase those in authority for enacting progressive change. Economic pressures were on their side, and the royal court of the Sorcerer's Kingdom strove for universal excellence. Everything was in place to begin the transformation of their nation into the beacon of civilization that the Sorcerer King desired. All that was left to do was to do it. I guess that something like this is usually impossible, the Guildmaster chuckled. It makes it too hard to believe. Make no mistake, Clara replied, the guilds still have many challenges ahead of them. Do not take your new freedoms for granted. I still technically hold all of the rights, authority and duties that come with my station. If I see that regulation is required, there is no doubt that I will act. If things get out of hand, I have no qualms rescinding these freedoms to re-examine the entire arrangement. The success of this experiment and further progressive measures will be in large part due to the efforts of the guilds and their members. Of course, my lady, the guildmaster nodded. As always, we understand that you do everything for the greater good of your subjects. Clara rose from her seat, offering the guildmaster a quiet smile as he brushed the crumbs of breakfast from his lap. He beamed as he bobbed his head before leaving her office. Shouldn't he be sweating a bit after having a threat like that hung over his head? He certainly would if he was speaking to Leanne. If it was Ludmilla, he would have probably fainted on the spot. Clara couldn't decide whether to be annoyed or not. When it came to herself and her friends, their image always preceded them, pulling whatever they presented up or down. Ludmilla could say something perfectly pleasant and it would terrify everyone around her. Leanne always left people wondering, though she often did that on purpose. Florine didn't need to say anything at all and thoughts invariably turned lewd, much to her embarrassment, which only led people on further. As for herself, Clara could sentence someone to death and they would probably thank her for it. Well, maybe that was an exaggeration, but they would at least respect her ruling and accept it with good grace. Supposedly, these outcomes were due to how they employed their job classes and how the skills and abilities that they had developed influenced others. That one could produce fear or adoration on demand was seen as a natural measure of a charismatic individual's ability, but once they started qualifying and quantifying everything according to the concept of class levels, things became a bit disconcerting. Everything that they did was suddenly part of an experiment as they strove to develop their capabilities. They could even gauge the capabilities of others by how well they could contend, which again was something once considered common sense, but warped by their new knowledge. Many other aspects of their former sensibilities were similarly cast in a new light. The common knowledge that people became stronger and more capable as they grew in their craft became stat arrays and skill growth that influenced the quality of a build. This, especially, was becoming very apparent to Clara, whose divine blood had now unmistakably manifested. Where she was once no stronger, faster or resilient than an average city girl, she was now as physically capable as a silver-rank adventurer, and that was without the equipment bestowed upon her by Lady Schultier. With it, she could do things that shocked the people around her. That being said, she was no warrior. The growth of her physical capabilities was more a convenient side benefit that came with her ongoing work as the head of House Corlin. With this being the case, she often wondered how strong Ludmilla now was, especially considering that she was an undead being with far greater physical capabilities than a human. Maybe I can get her to teach me how to fight a bit. That way we could. No, that is a sinful path. She needed to focus on her own way of doing things. It was one of the reasons why they went so well together, after all. Clara looked outside, squinting at the sun glinting against the river. It was roughly 2 hours to noon. She stretched as she went back down the tower stairs, sending one of her maids ahead to call for her carriage. An appointment in the Katza Plains with Brother Martelli and his squires awaited her. Brother Martelli, I have kept you waiting. Clara went up to where the veteran paladin was observing his squires practice in the palace gardens. His polished plate pauldrons glinted in the morning light as he turned at her voice. Think nothing of it, my lady, he said. The temples are here to serve. If anything, we are honored that you have taken an interest in our training today. My imagination keeps running off with me whenever I think about it, Clara replied, so I felt the need to settle things once and for all. Ah, it is nothing too exciting, Brother Martelli chuckled. There are dangers, to be sure, but the outskirts of the Katza Plains are just a bit more lively than the graveyard in Erantal. Those who started ahead of us now treat it as an entertaining weekly excursion. They accompanied Clara to her carriage, which set off on its way along the river. The two young squires stared at the scenery as it sped by vineyards and villages. What was normally a journey of 2 days took less than an hour between the Solita, the new vehicle frames from House Wagner, and the road paved over the winter. Xavier and Rosalina, if I'm not mistaken? The two children nodded at Clara's friendly query. Xavier was 9 while Rosalina was 8. And now they were being brought out to the Katza Plains to fight undead. Are you excited about your excursion? Clara asked. They nodded again. The two squires were wearing coat of plates under the customary tabards that they donned for civilian settings, as well as steel plate pieces for their arms and legs. They each also had a heater shield and warhammer, both fashioned to fit their stature. A careless glance might have one assumed that they were noble scions whose families possessed the wealth to indulge their children, but she doubted that any of her subjects would see them that way. For her part, Clara had been disturbed at the notion that children were being sent to fight very real and deadly opponents since she first heard of it. Brother Marcus explained that, as apprentices for most vocations started learning their trade somewhere above the age of 6, so too should squires be expected to start learning their trade at the same time. According to Ludmilla, the new rangers that she was raising commenced training around the same age as well. If she were here to listen to Clara's concerns, Ludmilla would probably say something along the lines of civilian nobles being too soft and give Clara's belly a playful poke. Brother Martelli, Clara said, how does one determine when a squire is ready for these excursions? Our measures are fairly straightforward, my lady, Brother Martelli replied. The squires go through daily combat drills in addition to the rest of their studies. Once a week, their performance is assessed by holding non-lethal bouts against summoned opponents. Actually, for some reason the elder liches standing by at the army bases are always happy to participate in their training, so the kids get to fight against all sorts of things every day. The reason why the elder liches were participating in the squires' training was straightforward, it was training for them, as well. Every undead servitor was created with basic knowledge of its capabilities, but they had no experience. Any opportunity to gain experience was treated as precious and better equipped them to serve their creator. One might think it strange to consider an undead being as an earnest individual, but they were very pure in that sense. Clara examined the two squires, who shifted under her gaze. How strong would you say they are now? They are progressing much more swiftly than squires would in the theocracy. If I were to use local measures, they are both around difficulty rating 15. Difficulty rating 15 is about the strength of an iron rank adventurer, isn't it? Clara furrowed her brow. Are you saying that they could win in a fight against an ogre? An inexperienced ogre, yes. However, issues of reach and mass would exist in practice. Also, like any apprentice, they are still learning their craft and thus limited compared to ordained professionals. Additionally, the development of our squires here is lopsided. She looked back at Brother Martelli, who was seated across from her. His expression was not precisely troubled, but his tone still suggested that the lopsidedness was a serious matter. How so? It is not in any way a complaint, of course, the paladin said, but our curriculum for squires and acolytes has been honed over centuries to raise students to an established standard under the conditions that you would see in the theocracy. First is mundane education, which covers language, mathematics, law and basic life skills. Then there is religious education, which also includes our role as members of the temple staff and its ministry. Finally, is our martial education, which is both theoretical and practical. I guess the practical part would be what most outsiders think of when paladin or cleric comes to mind. The lopsided part comes with the fact that there were no paladin orders in the sorcerer's kingdom before we arrived. Captain Cavallaro informed me that ordination would be irregular since you've included children that were much older than you usually would. Is what you speak of in addition to that? Yes, my lady, Brother Martelli nodded. Priests and paladins attending institutions in the theocracy usually start at the age of 6 and are ordained around the age of 14 or 15. They are treated as junior staff until 20. We can smooth things out here if it was only an issue with the time needed to complete their education, but what surprised us was their physical advancement. For instance, these two have been squires for half a year, but they have the strength of third-year squires in the theocracy. And this is because they've been training with the elder liches every day? Amongst other things, the overflowing support that we have received in the Sorceress Kingdom has been a great blessing, but time is one resource not so easily procured. For the time being, while they might physically match squires of their age in the theocracy, they do not have the years of education, discipline and experience that comes with it. A 9-year-old with the strength of an iron rank adventurer. She imagined that all sorts of problems would crop up. Beyond the fact that children were children, growing up came with all sorts of physical and mental changes that took time to grasp and develop mastery over. What kinds of issues do you foresee, Brother Martelli? Boys will always be boys, of course, the paladin seemed to shrug, so we will have to emphasize how the actions that come with their rowdiness can produce extreme results compared to other boys of their age. Girls can be extremely vicious once they get going. Captain Cavallaro had some interesting stories about Sister Alessia, but I am half certain that he was just trying to scare us. You must have one in mind if you're leaving it on that note. Again, I do not know how true this is, but a few years ago Sister Alessia was in a particularly foul mood about something. Captain Cavallaro told her to go work off her frustrations in Katza, so off she went. He found out later that she ended up attacking an elder lich. It is said that the elder lich ran away from her, which is quite strange in itself. Ah, Clara nodded. That story is actually true. It is, my lady? How does one confirm a story such as this? Captain Iska was the elder lich that she attacked. Brother Martelli turned his head to look at Rosalina. What is it, Brother Martelli? The squire smiled back at her master. Nothing, Brother Martelli replied. Anyway, it is something we will have to keep a careful eye on. It is against our tenets to stifle personal development, so we cannot simply tell them to stop training if that is what they wish to do. I would not do that even if it was not against our teachings, Clara said. It is our system of education that needs to adapt to new realities. The temples are far from the only ones that must do so in the Sorceress Kingdom. You speak truly, my lady. Still, we are in a state where much change is required but few educators are available. It will be a while before we catch up. What are your numbers looking like at the moment? Not counting Sister Alessia, who is still a junior temple staff member, we have half a dozen paladins in Erantal and 30 in Corlin County. Each of us has taken 2 squires and we will take 2 more every 3 years. For the time being, we have a 9-year curriculum plan so Xavier and Rosalina will be ordained at the ages of 18 and 17, respectively. When will they count as fully fledged temple staff? Brother Martelli sucked in his lips, looking out the window at the river. That is difficult to say, he said. As much as I would like us to have our first class of paladins recognized according to custom, we will have to see how things go in practice. It may go the full term after ordination. It was only their shortage of temple staff that made the delays seem larger than they were. Clara predicted that it would only take 7 or 8 years to normalize things. The squires and acolytes between now and then could still help out in the temples without being ordained. The only places where the shortage was truly telling was in locations without temple staff at all. A fully fledged cleric was required to oversee a shrine or temple and they had very few of those relative to the projected growth of the settlements in need of their services. I'm sure we'll be able to manage through our initial challenges, Clara said. While staffing shortages are a concern, the number of temple staff should swell to healthy numbers in the next 2 decades. Healthy numbers of course did not mean having enough temple staff to comfortably service the congregations in the southern territories of the Sorceress Kingdom. It meant having enough clerics and paladins to raise new shrines, monasteries and temples beyond. Their work in Corlin County was merely the first step in returning the populations of the north to the fold. It would be a monumental venture that spanned generations, but the foundations they laid in the Sorceress Kingdom would be nigh unshakable. Their god had returned to once again live amongst them, after all. After following the river for another half-hour, they reached the dividing line between the fertile valleys of the riverlands and the barren reddish clay of the Katza Plains. The road, however, did not end there. Somewhere in the mists beyond, construction continued as the Ministry of Transportation laid down a highway that followed the Katza River. Other highways would branch off of it to create a road network linking the territories surrounding the barren wasteland. This gave the Sorceress Kingdom exclusive access to routes, as only the undead could safely use them. The road network was merely a bonus, however. The true treasure was the maritime corridor that the Katza River provided. It had been nearly a year in the making, but Clara was now on the eve of her first great offensive. Her carriage slowed and turned off of the road, stopping in an area serving as a stockpile for the roadway. They stepped out into the middle of a lot lined with raised and covered sections partially filled with pre-prepared construction materials. The Sorceress Kingdom's undead servitors could not build roads as the dwarves could, but they were able to fit things together. As with many other professional tasks, anything beyond a certain threshold of complexity or employed special skills and abilities simply failed in various ways. Most of the time, things just broke apart. No one knew how perfectly good materials could do that, but they unapologetically did nonetheless. It wasn't limited to construction, either. Once, her chef tried to teach a vampire bride how to cook and she could only produce charred abominations. Clara once joked to Ludmilla about burning water while trying to prepare tea for herself, but a vampire bride might actually be able to. Lady Aura, who had experience in accommodating those shortfalls with a construction project of her own in the past, shared several insights with them. As long as tasks were kept menial, things would work without a hitch. Thus, Clara, Leanne and Florine had put their heads together late in the autumn to figure something out. Leanne quickly came up with a solution, though Clara suspected that it was something that she had been considering for a long time. With the growth of her new workshops came a world of new possibilities. Her evolving machining industry made high-precision tools and parts possible, which in turn allowed for the mass production of standardized goods. They could make 100,000 identical screws and an equal number of nuts that could perfectly fit those screws. Everything could be made with unerring precision, and the motive force provided by undead labor allowed craftsmen to fashion parts with unheard-of rapidity. This of course extended to any industry that adopted Haus Wagner's innovations and devices for standard measurement. As a result of the savings in time, fuel and labor, prices for many once expensive goods were bound to collapse. For the time being, the nationwide effort to bring everything in line with new standards of industry and infrastructure was consuming everything, but they needed to ensure that none of their tenants were left behind in the transition. It took about a month of trial and error, but a new system was designed that the undead servitors could safely use. Pieces of anything that needed to be constructed, including roads and buildings, were manufactured in Corlin Harbor or Leanne's still for some reason unnamed capital. Everything was then transported to the construction site for assembly. All that the undead working on the Katza Road network had to do was submit measurements from a construction site, and every brick, block, plank and pillar would be fashioned to fit their needs. It didn't come remotely close to the quality and appearance of dwarven craftsmanship, but it was fast, cheap and did the job. Brother Martelli led them to the edge of the stockpile area. Rosalina and Xavier hefted their shields and warhammers, peering out into the mist. A pair of Death Knights accompanied Clara as she followed behind the trio. The paladin kept glancing over his shoulder towards her as they followed the road deeper into the wasteland. "Do not worry about me, Brother Martelli," Clara said. "I have been out here several times." They were uneventful inspections of the border, but she doubted that much could happen with the Royal Army occupying the region. Roughly 500 meters down the road, they stopped at a simple, magically lit army post manned by an elder lich and 2 Death Knights. The lonely structure looked more than a bit odd in the otherwise featureless surroundings. Brother Martelli walked up to the window facing the road. "Brother Martelli with Squires Xavier and Rosalina. We're here to use the exercise grounds." The elder lich pulled out a black binder from under the counter, slowly flipping through the pages. "Is this your first time here?" it asked. Yes," the paladin answered. "Is there some problem? According to our estimates, things should be ready by now." A map appeared on the counter between the elder lich and the paladin. "Sections A1 through to H3 are depleted," it said. "The closest replenished sections may be found further northeast. Please ensure that you refer to the marker posts for the appropriate difficulty rating ranges. The Sorceress Kingdom cannot be held liable for any damage or loss of equipment and death or injury, including any debilitating conditions sustained. This includes, but is not exclusive to, disease, poison, curses, ability damage, level drains, confusion, insanity, aging and loss of virility or hair. Have a nice stay." A swirl of dust blew across the road in front of the post. The elder lich stared across the counter at Brother Martelli. Clara leaned over to look at the paladin. "Brother Martelli?" Right." He took the map into his hand. "Thank you." They made their way northeast, ascending the gentle slope from the riverbank. After coming back from the Sorcerer King's Katza Plains excursion, Ludmilla had devised a way to turn the area near the border into a training ground. Past the buffer area that ran along the border, she had the Royal Army's patrols crisscross the area, dividing the wild undead into plots of different sizes and difficulties. These plots could then be used for live combat exercises. It took about a week for a dozen or so weak undead to replenish each plot, but there were hundreds of plots prepared and plenty of room along the border to create more. After walking for 15 minutes, Brother Martelli held up a gauntleted hand. "This looks like the place," he said. "Let us check over your equipment one last time, shall we?" The squires ensured their armor was fitted properly. Their sallets were closed tightly over their beavers and the joints of their armor secured. Despite being covered from head to toe without a bit of skin exposed, they didn't seem to have any issues moving around. Brother Martelli gave a satisfied nod before turning to address her. "My lady, please stand back while I bring them closer." In the distance, past a long iron stake painted with a single white stripe, she could make out figures standing unnaturally still in the mist. A chill that had nothing to do with the cool weather traveled up her spine. "Are you sure this is all right?" she asked. "The most advanced squires have been doing this for over a month now," Brother Martelli answered. "There have been no major injuries yet. I believe that the temples should have submitted their reports." She did get reports from the temples, but she still couldn't quite wrap her head around it. There was nothing normal about bringing 8-year-olds out into a cursed wasteland to battle the undead. The paladins, however, treated it like farmers taking their children on a trip to the local town. "Are we ready?" "Yeah." The two squires raised their war hammers above their heads in an enthusiastic reply to Brother Martelli's query. Clara silently shook her head. Maybe this was why Sister Alessia was the way that she was. Brother Martelli walked forward a bit, tapping his weapon against his shield. Several figures reacted to the sound, moving towards them at different speeds. 5 zombies and 3 skeletons. You two go ahead and take care of them." "You are quite calm about this, Brother Martelli," Clara noted. "Ah, this is nothing much," the paladin replied. "If anything, you are fortunate to have this place." The 3 skeletons reached the squires first. Rosalina blocked a bare-handed strike and then brought her warhammer in under her shield to shatter one of her opponent's legs above the knee. It reached out to grab her ankle but received a hole in its skull in return. Xavier knocked back one of the skeletons with his shield. He immediately turned and stepped in to destroy the pelvis of the other before it could react to his sudden movement. The squire crushed its neck beneath his boot as he moved forward to dispatch the one he had knocked back. "Oh, that was a mistake, Xavier," Brother Martelli said. The boy looked around for a moment before realizing his advance had attracted a dozen more undead. He backed away, throwing a nervous glance in Brother Martelli's direction. "The battlefield is an honest place," the paladin told him. "Your enemies will punish errors in judgment to the fullest extent possible, as may your allies if you do something unforgivably stupid or reprehensible." But what do we do?" Xavier asked. "What else can one do?" Brother Martelli shrugged. "One must answer for their mistakes. Sursana's measure does not discriminate." Brother Martelli kicked the first of the new wave of undead that reached them into another. The second skeleton's skull exploded under the force of his warhammer. He continued working his shield and weapon, stepping around smoothly as he went from kill to kill. When much tougher-looking zombies from the first group finally reached him, they appeared to offer no more resistance to the veteran paladin's attacks than the skeletons did. "If this were not training," he said, "it means that you reap what you sow. Except it may not only be you that answers for your errors, but everyone fighting with you. As a paladin, you must not only be mindful of how your actions affect yourselves and your fellow warriors, but also all who rely on your protection. It is not enough to take actions you are prepared to pay for, you must ensure that your allies are not forced to pay for them as well." The paladin stepped aside and they waited for a group of 4 zombies to make their way over. One of them clutched the edge of Rosalina's shield, dragging it down while the other wrapped its arms around her. "Eek!" she cried, "get off." "The main threat that zombies represent," Brother Martelli said, "is grappling with their unnatural strength. Once one grabs onto you, it makes it easier for more to do so. Unless they are under the control of something else, they will not coordinate, but their interference will make it easier for other opponents to act against you." "Brother Martelli," Clara resisted the urge to step forward and help the girl. "Should you not do something about those zombies?" "She will be fine, my lady," the paladin waved his hand. "These zombies are stronger than the average farmer, but are no match for our squires here. Zombies can also resort to clawing and biting, but they won't be able to get through her armor. The longer she stays like that, however, the worse she will smell." Indeed, it seemed that, despite her panic, Rosalina didn't budge. She made an annoyed sound before dropping her warhammer to draw the dagger from her belt. After being jabbed several times in the ribs, the zombie clinging to her flopped to the ground. The squire put her dagger away before picking up her warhammer again and whacking the other zombie in the head. "I want my worries back." Nearby, Xavier was done dispatching his opponents. Clara couldn't see through their visors, but she could imagine their disgusted looks as they tried to wipe away the viscera smeared over their armor. "Never forget your footwork," Brother Martelli told them. "In many cases, how you use your feet is more important than how you use your arms. While paladins are very sturdy, rooting oneself to the ground and trying to withstand everything is seldom the correct answer even when you're holding a narrow passage. In this case, zombies are slow and mindless. Against such opponents, you have the luxury of choosing when and where to engage and how they are positioned when you do so. Brother Martelli drew the attention of a few more undead. After dispatching the skeletons, he let the zombies shuffle up to him. Many physical combatants require space to fight, he said as he sidestepped in a circle around them. Unless one is incorporeal, one cannot be in the same place as others. Everything also has its own measure, the effective range of its offense. As you can see with these fellows, I am using the ones in front to block the others and they are all interfering with one another trying to get to me. Brother Martelli picked up his pace until the zombies formed into a tight mass trying to reach him. Eventually, their attempts to get past one another led to them stumbling to the ground. The mindless undead cared nothing for those around them, stepping and tripping over each other. The paladin kicked the head off of one of them, which bounced over to attract the remaining undead in the first group. Now, let us finish these off and move on to the next group. The two squires dutifully voiced their acknowledgement. The zombies were the size of adult humans, but Rosalina and Xavier may as well have been slaughtering chickens for all the difficulty they had with them. Is this how you trained your previous squires? Clara asked. I was overly cautious with my first squire, Brother Martelli answered with a self-deprecating smile. Children learn quickly and squires are tougher than they look. It just takes some experience to understand this and wrestle down the urge to protect them against things they can easily handle. Rosalina and Xavier finished their task and they started walking over to the next patch of undead. The two used the towels tucked into their belts to wipe away the mess in their armor as best as they could. As for how we trained them, Brother Martelli said as they strolled along, as I mentioned earlier, what is made available to us here is superior. I would even go so far as to say it is luxurious. Even on the theocracy side of the Katza Plains, we bring whole squads of squires because opportunities for real combat in relatively safe conditions are scarce. Elsewhere, they help in border patrols but monsters and wilderness tribes do not replenish their numbers so frequently. Brother Marcus said something about Sister Alessia causing a great panic when she and some other squires went into the wasteland of their own volition. Well, she was his first squire. Sister Alessia is also a prodigy and prodigies can be difficult to handle in many ways. Most importantly, they went unsupervised. Weak undead in small numbers are not a threat to our squires but other types of undead can be mixed in. Incorporeal types are especially bad since they ignore armor and require magic or enchanted weapons to hit. A few minutes later, they arrived at the next group of undead. Brother Martelli drew a handful over and, after ensuring that nothing problematic was on its way, he settled back to watch. Does the theocracy do this with other vocations? Clara asked. The regular army has to make do with drills and patrols. Our mana economy revolves around servicing civilian sectors and what we have to spare goes into training our elites or conducting magical research. Luxurious seemed an apt description for the broad situation in the Sorceress Kingdom. Material abundance was growing, security was beyond adequate and the administration was likely unmatched in the region. Clara had questions as to how the other territories would take advantage of their circumstances, but followers of the Six tended to squander little. After clearing another two groups of undead, Brother Martelli peered deeper into the mist. Having so many summons available for training really does throw off our schedule. Let us head in further. What usually happens? Clara asked. Usually, we start practical training around difficulty rating 6, by adventurer standard, Brother Martelli answered. If it is a big group of undead, they can fight together. If not, they take turns. Either way, it takes longer and we have to be more cautious. The equipment that the temples have provided is excellent as well. Keeping up with growing children is an expensive prospect. I hope it doesn't come off as extravagant. Brother Martelli laughed. How can this be? He said, if anything, the support that we receive here is heartening. I would still like to improve wherever possible, Clara said. Are there any practices in the theocracy that you believe will do well here? That is difficult to say, my lady. Faith is an integral aspect at all levels of society in the theocracy. Things that I may consider desirable are simply not allowed here. It is strange, in the theocracy, the temples loom over the judicial, legislative and military branches of our government. Here, The temples are not part of the government at all, and your royal court looms over everything. Still, there should be some things that can be adopted. I can only present general ideas. The mana economy here is immature, for lack of a better term. It is my understanding that Reistais is not only secular but has poor integration of magic in general, and this territory has inherited the problems that come with that. That much was painfully true. While the rationale behind a secular state was to keep religious agendas from influencing the government, it had a variety of negative effects. In Reistais, secular was as good as saying mundane. The population did not incorporate magic in any way aside from the occasional convenience. The temples, which represented the largest demographic of magic casters in the nation, existed as a separate, similarly convenient entity that provided health care, spiritual guidance and education for the lucky few with access to temple schools. That the average individual lived a life of subsistence meant that magic never truly went beyond an esoteric industry that produced expensive luxuries and services with little exposure. Concepts like mana economy were entirely alien, and many industrial sectors were untapped. Due to this background, the idiom pearls before swine accurately described the situation of the average human subject of the sorcerer's kingdom when it came to magic. Even now, it was often the case that visitors from the empire and the theocracy pointed out amazing things that the locals took for granted. When those things were brought to their awareness, all they could say was, "Hey, is that so?" While not understanding why it was. There was simply no appreciation for what went into anything because they were ignorant of so much. At best, the monetary value of a product or service was the only indicator of its value. Of course, one could not know the intricacies of everything, but their common knowledge was embarrassingly unsophisticated. Raising public awareness of magic above the level of superstition and folklore is something we have been working to address. Though for some reason, Baroness Zaradnik appears to be in the lead when it comes to that. Well, it is as they say, yes? Technology and magic tend to go to the military first. Baroness Zaradnik is a military governor, so I suspect that her territory will be at the forefront in many fields where militarization is possible. Ludmilla's tendency to militarize everything did tend to result in her quick adoption of all sorts of things. That being said, her development employed brute force methods that incurred hefty costs and created products with much room for refinement. Still, the raw violence by which she pursued new ideas tended to produce results. Regardless, it is still something that the rest of us need to consider for our territories, Clara said. The spirit of her subjects is distinctly different from ours and thus produces different results. Is there something you can think of that may only manifest in civilian settings? The system of temple donations, perhaps. Actually, yes, I believe that you will see that happening at some point. Can you describe this system to me? It is one where priority services can be purchased by more affluent members of the congregation. A number of alarming connotations popped up in Clara's head at his summary. What is the rationale behind this system? Mana is limited and certain spells have high material costs. Scheduled rates for mana go up exponentially with higher tiers of magic, especially if it is cast through a ritual or requires expensive components. Our limitations result in queues, but one can pay extra to expedite treatment. How much do they pay? Triple the scheduled rate, my lady. What happens to the donation? 1/3 goes towards paying for the spell, of course. The rest subsidizes care for those less fortunate. Outsiders who come to the theocracy for treatment sometimes complain that we are taxing the rich, but we consider it a practical form of charity. I see. Clara let out a relieved sigh. It wouldn't be good if she had to strangle one of her new paladins in front of his squires. A part of her felt guilty for suspecting that something untoward was going on, but it reminded her too much of the privileged abusing their authority in Reistais. Ah, it looks like we have some ghouls in this bunch. You may want to stand apart from us for this, my lady, they have quite the aroma. She stepped back as they prepared to clear the patch of undead. Aside from the ghouls, it looked like the same variety of zombies and skeletons from before. Bleh, it stinks, Rosalina cried. Ah ha ha, now you know why they would not summon these for us in town. Ghasts are even worse and their stench can inflict debilitating conditions. Adventurers passing through her old village always talked about how they risked their lives in the Katza Plains and shared many a story of daring do. While she did believe that they embellished their exploits somewhat, Clara didn't think that an excursion would be so carefree. Ah, watch that zombie there, It is actually a swell skin. Xavier kicked a slightly bloated-looking zombie away. He reached into a belt pouch and hurled a crystal vial at the fallen swell skin. The undead creature twitched on the ground as a hiss filled the air and pustules erupted over its flesh. Good job, Brother Martelli nodded. Even a drop of that ichor on your skin can result in disease. If it gets through your visor, well, let us just say the experience can be unpleasant. You have seen it happen before, Brother Martelli? Clara asked. Of course, the paladin answered. It happens to everyone eventually. The danger of these weak undead does not lie in their individual power but in all of the little tricks that they have. These naturally spawned undead manifest certain aspects of life. Many are familiar with how they represent negative emotions and the forces associated with negative energy, but they do not realize the fact that, as a whole, the undead carry themes. Another group of undead came in. Brother Martelli paused to rest his watchful gaze on the two squires as they met the hodgepodge of weak foes. Once their numbers were diminished, he nodded and continued. With undead such as these, he said, one experiences the inevitabilities that come with life as time marches on. A scratch here, a cut there, a minor illness that weakens one just a bit. Aches and pains and weariness. These small things can build up and become overwhelming, so vigilance must be constantly maintained. Even the mightiest warrior will fall prey eventually if there is no reprieve. Unless you are not affected by any of that, Clara noted. Of course, Brother Martelli nodded. Many equip themselves in such a way that they are protected from much of what can happen out here. Ultimately, however, we depend on our fellows. Whether they be the artisans that fashion equipment and curatives, those who produce our food and supplies, or our comrades who fight alongside us, we humans face the trials of life together. Alone, we are not much for very long. That is an interesting insight to have out here. It is as I said, no? Brother Martelli's hazel eyes seemed to smile from behind his visor. The battlefield is an honest place,